If I asked you what your favorite gun sight was in Siege, you'd likely say something like the 1.5, the 2x, or even one of the holographic sights. But I guarantee that none of you would consider the Acog as even an option. This is due to multiple factors over the years that have resulted in the Acog falling out of the meta. And today I'll be discussing how the Acog went from one of the most picked optics in the game to now being one of the least picked optics in the game. Our story today brings us all the way back to Siege's release on December 1st, 2015. On release, Siege's attachment options looked very different. The 1.5, 2x, and 3x all didn't exist. Also, the Acog was available on a large majority of defending and attacking operators. The fan favorite Ash R4C Acog and Jaeger 416 Acog all still existed, and they dominated on the battlefield. Jaeger was able to get easy spawn peeks off, and Ash was able to rush into the bomb site with her fast ADS speed and an Acog sight. But it didn't just stop there. Even the SMG-11 had Acog, which was absolutely outrageous and not needed. But this goes to show how many guns were able to get Acog back in the day. One of the reasons that contributed to the Acog being so good on defense was the quick ADS time to the past and the amount of spawn peeks that were available on most maps. Over the years, a lot of the maps have been reworked to prevent spawn peeking, which kind of lessened the need for an Acog on defense, and ADS speeds were slowed on top of that. Now, while the game may not have been balanced in the past, it was an absolute blast to play, but obviously Ubisoft was going to try to make their game as balanced as possible, which this is what marks the beginning of our beloved Acog's downfall. For the beginning of the downfall, we must go back to Operation Redcrow. This is the operation that would begin a recurring theme, and that recurring theme is removing the Acog sight off fan favorite operators. The first weapon to get the ban hammer was the SMG-11. It got its Acog removed at the beginning of the season, and it was one of Siege's most controversial changes at the time. People went back and forth on whether or not this change was good, some even claiming that it was nerfing the already weaker defensive side. But looking back on it, this was a good balancing decision on Ubisoft's part. Having a secondary weapon capable of taking long-range engagements with relative ease is really dangerous. So it makes sense why they did what they did, just at the time it wasn't viewed that way. But trust me, there are way more terrible things to come for our poor little Acog, and these would prove to push the community to their breaking point. The next stop for our story brings us to Operation Blood Orchid. This marked the first time primary weapons ever lost their Acogs, and unfortunately those weapons had to be Jaeger's 416 and Bandit's MP7. This was another hugely controversial change. Some people felt it was just Ubisoft listening to bad players who don't know how to counter spawn peeks, while others felt the change made sense and was a step in the right direction. No matter what your opinion is, after this change, Bandit and Jaeger continued to be some of the best operators in the game, despite the removal of their Acog, and they are still good operators to this day. Either way though, Jaeger and Bandit Acog are still missed to this day by most of the community. So much so that Ubisoft released a whole event around bringing these Acogs back. Now another Acog that is missed to this day would get removed a year later in Operation Burnt Horizon. If you've been playing Siege for a while, you likely know how popular the Acog on Ash's R4C really was. It was one of Siege's most iconic combos, almost as iconic as Jaeger's, so it's no surprise that the community would once again feel very mixed about its removal. But this actually made Ash better. Her win rate actually increased after the change. Due to her gun being more effective at close range, she actually performs worse when someone uses the Acog compared to a 1x. However, despite this fact, it is still missed today, and a large portion of the community hopes it will return someday. But our poor little Acog continued to get bullied by the Ubisoft balancing team, with the next major hit to the Acog being an Operation Shifting Tides. Operation Shifting Tide saw the removal of the most overpowered Acog to ever exist in Siege, that being the Alda 556 on Maestro. This is a high fire rate LMG that at the time had a super tight hipfire spread and a massive magazine size. This allowed Maestro to shred the attackers at pretty much any range. To this day, I still don't know why Ubisoft gave him the Acog on this LMG, and this Acog was one of the few that was actually praised by the community for getting removed. So overall, this was a positive change, but it still contributed to the Acog's downfall because once again, another good gun lost access to it. But the most painful season for the Acog had yet to come, that one being Operation Shadow Legacy. Operation Shadow Legacy was one of the worst seasons for the Acog in history. Firstly, new optics were introduced into the game that directly competed with the Acog. These included the 2x, 1.5x, and 3x sights, with the 1.5 becoming one of the most popular optics due to its great versatility, and the 2x becoming a strong competitor to the Acog. But these new sights weren't the only bad news. In Shadow Legacy, they removed the Acog from a record number of guns. These included the G8 LMG on IQ, the Commando on IQ, Zophia's M762, Jackal C7E and PDW, Habana's Type 89, and Buck's C8 assault rifle. There were many more guns that lost their Acogs in this season, but these are just the most notable ones. This was really the update that marked the death of the Acog as we know it. After the season, it was only available on a handful of weapons, and those that have it also have the 1.5 and 2x, which the 1.5 is better in 90% of situations. So the Acog really wasn't the same after Shadow Legacy, but the Acog suffering doesn't stop there. Ubisoft decided to come back and beat the dead horse once again in Operation Brutal Swarm. Brutal Swarm brought us a ton of balancing changes related to weapon attachments, but the one that matters for this video is the weapon sight rework. This change added and removed optics from a ton of operators, similar to what happened in Shadow Legacy. One of these changes was the removal of Acog from Sledge on his L8. Sledge at the time was one of the few operators where the Acog was widely used, and the removal of it left very little operators left that could use it effectively. Now, from what you've been seeing throughout this video, you may think that the Acog has had a huge downfall due to it being less widely available and having new competition, but there are some other problems with the base game that have assisted in its downfall, one being the massive uptick in recoil over the years. When Siege first started, recoil was much easier to control across the board, but through the seasons, Ubisoft has been making recoil more and more difficult to control, and the Acog sight just magnifies that recoil. This is because when you have a higher magnification on your optic, your visual recoil will increase. This makes some guns with high recoil become nearly impossible to control with an Acog. But another contributing factor is ADS speeds. Just like recoil, ADS speeds have been slowing down over the years. Whether it be nerfing the angled grip or ADS speeds across the board, everything is slower. This makes it harder for people to justify bringing a vertical grip. Now, why does this matter? Well, because without a vertical grip, recoil is more difficult, meaning that running an Acog would just make it worse. So not only is Acog less available than it once was, it is also not as viable as it used to be due to the state of recoil in Siege. In conclusion, the Acog has been slowly falling out of the meta over the years, but recently it has had a more drastic death spiral. Ubisoft has slowly throughout the seasons removed the Acog from most of the best weapons, which resulted in the Acog only being available on a handful of them, even on attack. Also, the additions of the 1.5 and 2 times has added some real competition to the Acog, which it has a hard time holding its ground against. On top of this, the slower ADS speeds and the higher recoil of today makes the Acog a lot less viable on most guns. So it appears that the Acog is a mere thing of the past. I don't see it ever coming back into the meta unless some drastic shifts at the Ubisoft balancing team occur. But I guess we'll have to see what the future holds. Let me know how you guys feel about the Acog in the comments down below. Do you still use it? If not, what is your favorite optic? I'd love to hear from you. Also, if you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you would consider subscribing. Your sub will make a difference, and you can always unsub later if you don't enjoy the content. If I haven't earned your sub yet, though, that is totally fine. You can go and watch this video, and hopefully it will change your mind. I'll see you next time, friends, and peace.